5. The convulsion of consciousness, which occurs correlatively with the threat to and destruction of culture, leads to a subjectivization of the concept of truth. As the props of man's consciousness in the circumstantial world of culture are knocked away, he falls into the crisis of consciousness, and all certainty vanishes. The possibilities which should be open to man in the grave metaphysical threat to his existence, that of recognizing the crisis and eliminating it, and that of basing his life on different foundations, are excluded. His consciousness gives up the struggle in face of the crisis, and the latter continues to increase. A change in the foundations of his existence, however, would compel him to set about rediscovering his conscience before God and surrendering his belief in his own perfection, and he is by no means ready to do this. Consequently, he erects against the crisis and convulsion of his circumstantial world a subjective perception, independent of the world around, and serving only to shut off his own consciousness and make his own existence secure. He knows where the causes of the crisis lie and how they can be removed. This subjectivization of the concept of truth is not brought into being for the first time by the crisis, but is in harmony with the principles of modern thought, and can appeal to them for support. After Descartes had asserted the self-certainty of consciousness, and set it in place of the self-certainty of religious experience, philosophy, passing via Berkeley, Kant, and Schopenhauer on to Gentile, has represented the reality of consciousness alone, and evaluated the natural visible and tangible world. It has thus been forced to build up the world from consciousness, that is to say, from the ego. Hence that desperate penetrative thinking of the last 3 centuries, which was finally wrecked by subjectivism and ended in nihilism. This fantastic attempt was made possibly only by propping itself on modern science, which in actual fact built up the world with the aid of the mathematical method from consciousness. The concrete, technical products of science have concealed the subjectivization of the concept of truth. And all went well so long as the external world remained quiet, directing itself in accordance with consciousness, as Hegel demanded. But the more unquiet and lively and unadaptable to consciousness the outer world became, the more passionately was advanced the priority of consciousness over being, of the ideal over the real, of the abstract over the concrete, and the more clearly did the subjectivity of truth reveal itself. The subjectivization of the concept of truth, which is ending in every man possessing and advancing his own truth, thus follows logically from the philosophic speculation of the last 3 centuries. The crisis shatters man's security in the outside world, and at the same time takes from him the certainty of his inner world. If he is to maintain himself as that perfected being based upon consciousness in which he believes, he must provide himself with a subjective interpretation of the event, one which disregards the outside world, wherever it threatens the internal image. And the aphorism credo, qui absurdum, is replaced by scio, qui absurdum. Behind the travail of consciousness lurks a bitter wretchedness, which thrusts at man from the metaphysical realm. There is no longer any question of perceptions reached in liberty, but of postulates made under compulsion to secure one's own consciousness and existence. The subjectivization of the concept of truth, then, is logically followed by the confessionalization of thought. Perception takes on a dogmatic character, knowledge merges into belief. We get an either, or pattern leading to a friend-foe relationship. The subjectivism of modern thought is a degenerative phenomenon which reveals itself more and more unmistakably in the 19th century. It is seen at its clearest in German idealism, which has the character of a great confession, subjecting to itself the whole of reality. In Hegel, the passion, toughness, and impatience characteristic of human exchanges today are already present. There is also a demonization of word and concept, which are losing their abstract scientific character and being filled with magical content. Man sinks beneath its power and is obsessed with his consciousness heightened to the limit and strained to breaking point. He is dragged into a war of creeds, joins the witch hunt, executes heretics, and uses the violent methods of the Inquisition, yet remains unaware of the fantastic nature of his own activity. The demonization of words and concepts finds expression in the numerous isms in whose birth the whole process of the darkening of consciousness is made visible. Modern man, as a conscious or rational being, excluded and denied other elements, and these won themselves a life of their own. This is true not only of the unconscious elements of the individual, but also of the unconscious elements of the collective body. The old religions, writes C.G. Jung, with their lofty and their laughable aspects, their kindly and their gruesome symbols, are not things born out of a clear sky but are the product of the collective unconscious. Such aboriginal forms live on in us and may at any moment burst upon us with annihilating force, against which the individual is powerless. Our frightful gods have only changed their names, and now they rhyme with ism. Or are there people with the impertinence to maintain that militarism or Bolshevism were brilliant inventions? 1 C. G. Jung, Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, 1938. In the subjectivization of the concept of truth, the confessionalization of thought, and the demonization of words and concepts, man's consciousness is filled with elemental psychic material and is darkened. He has not understood or mastered the crisis. The more he becomes aware of that, the stronger becomes his doubt about his consciousness containing truth. But he cannot give scope to this doubt, or he would fall headlong into despair. He therefore takes flight into subjective concepts, and claims an immutable verity, which changes personal relationships, whereas he had at least been open to communication via consciousness. Even this avenue is closed when consciousness becomes the sole ground of security, and any threat to it produces a crisis of existence itself. The man isolates himself from any assault upon his own subjective beliefs, no longer concerned in convincing or being convinced in debate. In order to clarify some grim problem, he believes fanatically, because he doubts that he alone knows the truth and must impose this faith on others, admitting no argument, lest he endanger himself and his existence. Discussion is possible only when those engaged believe that their colloquy will bring them nearer an indivisible truth. When each partner has to pay anguished attention and fight desperately to see that his own opinion is not shattered, lest he himself falls into the state of metaphysical crisis, dialogue becomes impossible. Dialogue is then replaced by monologue, each speaker striving to deprive his partner of an equal right to speak upon public platforms. There are still people who speak and people who listen, the former maintaining their position by saying only what others are willing to hear. But between man and man discussion has almost entirely ceased. Men have lost the art of listening. Each man goes vote collecting for the subjective truth he has thought out for himself, and needs to confirm his existence. People speak as if on fire, avoiding any pauses, talking loudly, and brutally interrupting others to avoid hearing objections. It is the flight from the other man's word to one's own, driven on by anguish lest contradiction should bring a shattering collapse. If one watches modern speakers, this immense anguish can be plainly seen in distorted features and convulsive gestures. Between men who are of relatively good will, as among friends and relations, or in the conventional restraints of society, fair play requires that each shall be given an opportunity to deliver his monologue. Deft hostesses resemble theatrical directors, mounting society as on a stage, and being at great pains to allocate the roles equitably and to give each person the proper cue for beginning his or her monologue. People then part without obligation, not having given or received a thing, but with a pleasant awareness of having at least maintained their own position. Such contacts end like a drawn game, they are aimless but they immunize the passions. Things are more difficult when two hostile monologists attempt to make a dialogue. There is no longer any question of a fair expression of debatable opinions, far less of any joint Socratic search for a truth not yet established. Their views a priori are not open to debate. The metaphysical foundations of each one's existence are opposed. And no proper discussion takes place, but behind the web of words and the masking of opinions there is a metaphysical battle to be or not to be. Passion and fanaticism are in play on both sides too. Remove the metaphysical threat. It is not a conversation, but a religious war in miniature, demanding the total annihilation of the opponent if one's own existence is to be preserved. These encounters engender on both sides a hatred which looses itself demonically. One's opponent has raised doubt concerning the all-holiest, and blasphemy against God has always been most severely punished. Until the outbreak of acute crisis, man was accessible to communication from consciousness, though not from conscience, but events have so changed him that he has become wholly inaccessible and fanatical. In melancholy vein Ortega y Gasset lays it down that the man whom we are analyzing is unaccustomed ever to look outside of himself for any instance of authority. The masses with which we have to do are stronger than they have been in any other time, but in contradistinction to the masses of tradition they are not to be drawn by anyone or anything out of their encapsulation, they are self-sufficient, or, in one word, unteachable. If things go on as they have been doing, it will become clearer day by day in Europe and reacting thence over the whole world, that the masses are in every sense untamable. The end of discussion is manifest in those countries where parliamentarism, based on the conviction that truth emerges from a free conflict of opinions, has broken down. All the partners to a debate stood on a common level, each convinced that he represented only part of the truth, and prepared to surrender to objections and counter-arguments. The parliamentary form lasts only so long as this communal feeling survives within a framework of traditional authority, equally binding on each of the partners. So long as the parties remain subject to this central authority, recognizing that they are only parties, that is to say parts of a whole, so long does discussion remain possible. But the moment the part believes itself to be the master of the whole truth, and party representatives talk at cross purposes, using the parliamentary tribune only to launch monologues at the public, parliamentarism has come to an end. Parliamentarism is only maintaining itself at a disadvantage. The principles of parliamentarian states open the door to totalitarian influence, and they are driven towards non-parliamentary measures in an effort to resist. Now that consciousness is showing signs of degeneration, there is a tendency to sidetrack equality and to re-erect a hierarchy among mankind. We are faced with a change in the hitherto prevailing attitude when a man declares, "Of course every person has consciousness, but one has more, another less. There is a natural inequality between human beings which has to be taken into account. The man whose consciousness is more acute has a deeper insight into events, and is better equipped to recognize their pattern of behavior, and thus to achieve a greater freedom of action." Admittedly, there is no scale to evaluate the degree of consciousness, but the man eludes the point, suggesting that development has always settled this question, so to say organically, men with better consciousnesses having contrived to arrive and thus to constitute themselves an elite, a set of intellectual leaders or an intelligentsia. George Sorel's thoughts on force, Friedrich Nietzsche's will to power, and Vilfredo Pareto's ideas concerning the cycle of the elite have stood as godparents to the idea. They retain the prevailing view as to the arbitrary nature of events and the capacity of human consciousness to perceive them and dominate them, but introduced an aristocratic element, in conceding consciousness only to the small stratum which is convinced that it has really perceived what is happening. Signs of the change can be found in the fact that intelligence is again beginning to embody an esoteric and aristocratic attitude. The term masses is taking on a scornful and derogatory ring. The masses are being contrasted with the elite, who are getting together into circles. A new hermeneutic eclecticism is growing up. What is really important is that the concept of equality is being rejected, resisted, and destroyed. Without question, there is an hierarchy on the human plane. And equality among men exists only in the eyes of God. If man loses his godly counterpart, it matters little whether he stands for equality or inequality, since in either case he will end in the worst of despotism. The hierarchical elements which consciousness is beginning to rediscover serve to lay the foundation of Caesarism. Throughout the whole history of mankind, intelligence has not been found at the peak of an earthly hierarchy, that is to say, possessed of power. It has always been persecuted, its stigma always been its powerlessness. All consciousness has its roots. Suffering, writes Max Scheler, and all higher grades of consciousness. In ever greater suffering, the intellect has always been. So much the greater the less power it had, and force the stronger the less intelligence it had. Such is the law which dominates the polaric tension between intellect and force. It is in desperation that the spirit yields to the unassuageable hunger for power. No new elite can be founded upon this, quite apart from the fact that there is no measuring rod by which its status can be recognized. Inner value is not determined by its bearer believing in it, feeling himself to be representative of the elite, or being counted part of a ruling clique. It is the spirit of our times which reaches agreement with power. History usually displays great individuals at war with their own age. The attempt to introduce an hierarchy is characteristic of a consciousness which is in danger and seeks a basis for isolation. The path to dictatorship and despotism begins with aristocratic components being built into a world philosophy founded upon consciousness. The possibility of real insight into events is no longer conceded to all men alike, but only to a small governing stratum, or priestly caste. This stratum busies itself discovering a correlation between cause and effect, and over the first establishment of laws. These so-called laws are no longer assimilated by free, creative consciousness advancing from the safe ground of faith, but by a consciousness which has already degenerated into which recognition has become a necessity. When the laws have been recognized and the necessary measures laid down in a pseudo-divine plan, the world order itself announces the fact, and no one has the right to take a stand against it. It would be as grave an undertaking as for earlier man to reject God. The elite naturally desire to have their perceptions transformed into reality. If they find an opportunity for this by themselves, attaining power, something inhuman and demonic will occur. For now a morbid fanatical human consciousness is ruling, which can escape from personal responsibility in the assumption that events take place according to laws of their own. The man who possesses power today takes what measures seem to him to be necessary coldly and unmoved, because he regards them as an essential part of destiny. The responsibility linking him with events has been ruptured. An astronomer who, as the result of his observations, had reached the conviction that cosmic changes were about to usher in a new glacial age would be quite cool and passionless in pressing the government to take appropriate measures. A man encased in consciousness believes with similar impassibility and finality in the results of his observations. The patriarch who sold his subjects as mercenaries and sent them to their deaths in order to better his own finances was still to be judged on a human basis. An appeal to his humanity at least offered a chance of some success. At worst he came under the rubric of human frivolity, malice, and depravity. But the despot of consciousness has become inaccessible to reproach. he feels himself to be but the instrument of higher laws into which his consciousness has gained insight. Any appeal to his humanity would be impassively rejected, since he believes in the absolute necessity of the measures he has enacted. It is easy to form a wrong idea of the type, judged by his acts. He appears a monstrosity of frightfulness and depravity. But that is to evaluate him by conscience, whereas it is no longer possible to reach him even from the level of consciousness. He belongs to a small esoteric group which no longer debates nor seeks the truth, but believes itself to be already in possession of it. He is the representative of a human cerebrum which has swollen up and grown independent. Like a cancer, possessed of power, he gives practical effect to the formula God equals human consciousness. His fellow man who rejects his authority becomes an opponent, threatening the ego's own verity, and must be overcome. Any form of power may be employed, from amiability and persuasion or bribery up to direct action with cautious or revolvers. It is one of the peculiarities of power that it hungers for voluntary and spontaneous confirmation which it is unable to secure. A hopeless sense of loneliness arouses hatred of those who cannot or will not confirm the despot's subjective truth, and therefore refuse to provide him with the metaphysical basis of existence. In this hatred consciousness attains the extreme point of its reserve, and is driven to approve of the crisis for punishing and destroying its opponents. It retains its likeness to God, the being who rules and punishes. At this extremity modern man superficially resembles his forebears. Like them, he regards the crisis as a judgment and a punishment. But whereas they traced it to their own guilt and accepted it as their punishment, modern man looks upon it as the guilt and punishment of the other man. The crisis has occurred only because the other man is what he is, i.e., because he has not apprehended or not obeyed my truth. When one meets such conduct in a man who has ruled a nation, 150 men in this world, for 12 years and led it into catastrophe, it appears peculiar, yet, to maintain the certainty of one's own consciousness by counting other people guilty, foreigners, an alien social class, even one's own people or social class has become characteristic of mankind. As a final security, consciousness sails with the storm of the crisis, and approves the event as judging and punishing the other man. Thus, man can shield himself from the crisis and exclude any possibility of personal change. Such behavior must intensify the crisis, driving it to the limit of annihilation. 6. The darkening of consciousness expresses itself in a variety of forms, beginning with skepticism and ending with nihilism. Doubt, the motive element in modern thought, first displayed itself in the superior laughter of the Frenchmen of the world, and, finding expression in Montaigne, continued in Giron and Sanchez, to end up as a method in Descartes. Consciousness, walled off from conscience, and thus relieved of its relationship to God, demands absolute security and confirmation, and these it seeks by the creating of doubt. De omnibus dubitandum est. Everything must be doubted. Such doubt destroys everything which gets into the focal heat of its lens and negatively affirms the power of consciousness. But it needs a standing ground if it is not to destroy itself. Skepticism finally impinges upon man as a thinking being. Certainty is therefore found in comprehension itself. It is based on the self-certainty of thought. Hence begins that penetrative torturing process of modern thought which has to pass from consciousness into being, and from the ego has to build up the world, to collapse finally under the task. Doubt, driving thought over any available faith to destroy it, can chalk up the destruction as its own triumph, so that man's consciousness is confirmed and reinsured from the negative side. Beyond that, man lives in the expectation that on the far side of destruction, experienced by him as liberation, he will erect the system of his own certainty, without suspecting that it only draws its own sustenance from the decomposition of the substance of faith and will itself. Collapse when the last remnants of faith have been destroyed. Since being conscious, so long as man is an imperfect unfinished being, can never be identical with being, modern thought resembles the man who, with ever increasing zeal, is sawing away the bough on which he sits. Skepticism changes as the material of faith available for destruction declines. The confirmation arising from negation declines with it, at which point skepticism undergoes a swift transformation, finding expression in many variations, all of them driving on to nihilism. In its clean original form, skepticism is found today only in the broad masses. Having remained longest in possession of the material of faith, they continue to find matter of value not yet decomposed and still able to confirm the skeptical method. The broad masses have never based their existence upon consciousness, but have always remained close to the primitive, in the majority of cases being mastered by their instinctive urges, hunger and love, power and confirmation. In these conditions boredom seldom arises. There is little room for doubt, and none at all for despair. The broad masses have only mastered the skeptical method as a useful weapon in the fight for elementary needs. Moreover, it serves to justify the brutal inconsiderateness which the crisis forces upon those striving to maintain themselves. Nonetheless, it renders them less accessible to communication, and creates problems of oppressive gravity. During the centuries from Montaigne and Descartes, a great social reversal has taken place. The skeptical method, which at the beginning was employed only at the peak of the intellectual hierarchy, has now become the heritage of all, while at the peak of the intellectual hierarchy men are groping in despair for a new faith against the threatening background of nihilism. The immediate effects of skepticism may be very different in people who occupy different social worlds. Thus, discussing the problem of double morality, which arose from the idea of the reason of state and activated the ruling caste in earlier days, Karl Mannheim says, whereas in earlier days there existed a social moralistic division of toil, through which the little man was able to retain his decorous morality, and it was only the ruling cliques who felt the conflict. Through democratization this problem is constantly growing more acute. What the further fate of public morality is to be when the broad masses have appropriated the secret of the tiny leadership cliques is more than we can foresee. Democracy, acting like a lift, keeps springing cynicism and sarcasm in ever greater quantities from above to those below. Whilst, however, originally cynicism and sarcasm are more sublimated forms of an embarrassment, evasive forms of a soul grown complex and seeking to answer the unanswerable. As mass movements, they become pure brutality, which one has no longer any reason to conceal. They inspire the day-to-day morality of the little man, who uses power diplomacy as it was once used in the secret acts of leading statesmen. Every crisis tends, by the sheer weight of the external events, reduce men to their primitive vital foundations, and it gives over command to those who can travel intellectually light. It is the freebooters who find their way to the dominant positions. Every crisis, writes Jacob Burckhardt, is accompanied by a definite quota of adroit reserved and ice-cold men swimming along with it. They want to advance themselves and will be ready to do so by any means. This kind of hold-fast, pinch-kick, and steal away will swim to the top at any price, and all the more securely in that no higher urges lead them astray. Here and there one of them gets caught and perishes. But the genus as such remains eternal, whereas the primary and leading men of their time can be counted on the fingers and are extinguished by the ever-increasing crisis. What is eternal upon earth is the average. Karl Mannheim, Man and Society in the Transition Age. Jacob Burckhardt, Considerations on World History. Macaulay accounts among them nearly all the politicians of the English crisis. Among the statesmen, he writes, who were at the head of the big parties in the state from the Restoration to the accession of the House of Hanover, one can only name very few, whose reputation has not been smirched by what in our age would be called gross faithlessness and corruption. It is scarcely an exaggeration to say that the most unprincipled men in public life who have taken part in state business during the times we remember, would deserve to count as conscientious and public-spirited men if taped by the measure in use during the last part of the 17th century. T.B. Macaulay, History of England. Already in the French crisis of the 18th century the number of those knowing how to sail with the gale of the crisis is greatly increased, the leveling of the hierarchy and the dissolution of all values have led to the quota of adroit reserved and ice-cold men in today's historical crisis being many times greater. Now that the skeptical method is generally familiar, the type has ceased to be an exception, and waxes with the growth of the crisis. But while making use of the skeptical method, it does not do so for philosophical ends. It certainly displays the untrustingly questing, knowing doubting eyes, but they look out of a face which has been drawn by the primitive vital needs for hunger and love, for power, and for acceptance, and scorns every intellectual relationship as a farce. It is the paradox of the skeptical method that it can be overcome only by itself, after attaining the point where doubt begins to doubt about itself and passes into a state of despair. But there is no going back. Man never escapes from the mill of doubt as he enters it. The cogwheels only release a person transformed, one upon whose new material they lose their grip. The extreme point of despair is nihilism, but it does not constitute anything durable. The individual passes through it, to experience either his transformation or his end. Absolute nihilism appears psychologically impossible. Writes Karl Jaspers. It is psychologically inevitable as a stage, if life desires to attain self-consciousness. Everything that is dead and final has first to be set in question, has to be drawn into the witch's kettle of nihilism, if a new vital form is to emerge. Nihilism is not to be avoided by trying to dodge it, but has to be experienced as is only possible in states of internal despair if it is to be overcome, and to become the bare element it is in all intellectual types. It is in the world of mental life the destroyer of the non-vital such as has the appearance of life. Every form of life at some time or other assumes the role of nihilism, but life itself does not do so. Karl Jaspers, Psychology of Viewpoints on this World. It is as an individual that man passes this point. He stands then for himself alone, not for the body collective, and he reaches the body collective again only when he has built himself new material, which comes under the law of distributive virtue. That is to say, he has to build up the community and spend himself in doing so, for the collective body, often wrongly assumed to be the individual's mother soil, is a Moloch living upon his substance. For that reason, the process of development which began with individual skepticism does not extend until the collective body is skimming the residue of values without substance, but extends to the point where the individual in despair reaches the doorway of nihilism and the threshold of another plane of being, beginning with the individual's skepticism at the peak of the hierarchy. The modern historical epoch ends with the individual's transformation in face of the either or of nihilism. To establish how near skepticism has now got to nihilism, therefore, and what point in the developmental process we have reached, it is necessary to hunt at the peak of the shadowy hierarchy among the few in whom and through whom things in the mental world are settled. The peak is no longer represented by science as a whole. Even science has become a civil servant of the collective body. Its members belong to the strong body of intellectual officials who have to satisfy the needs of primitivism and vitalism among the masses. Of the hierarchy can be reckoned only that small body of men who dare now, as of old, to expose themselves to the pressure of the unknown and to follow a developmental process to its end. And this layer has become very thin all over the world, and is seldom in the limelight. But at the apex of this well-hidden hierarchy today the representative attitude is one of relativism. Under the concept of relativity, perception is regarded as valid only under certain definite conditions, thus losing all claim to being absolute. It depends upon the relationship of the perceiving subject to the object perceived, in which psychological factors play an important part. In the perception of relations, consciousness can at times reach comparative certainty, but it finds itself among innumerable possibilities and lacking the one reality it needs for absolute certainty. Human consciousness thus comes into conflict with innumerable new worlds. It may be referred to that multidimensional world of spherical trigonometry which was a prerequisite for Einstein's theory of relativity, or the inside versus outside world of biology, which leads to just as many different life worlds, or the relativism of microphysics, exemplified today in atomic physics, which satisfies itself with imprecision and probabilities, and brings the law of causality into question, or in the philosophical, the historical, the artistic, or as many other relativism as you like. Our crisis today is the crisis of Promethean science as a religion of reason, writes K. von Neergaard. Everything has become relative. Infinite numbers of people have no longer any absolute system of values, whether in this world or a world beyond. That must mean the end of culture, the decline of the West, unless we find a new system of values, or are given one. K. von Neergaard, A Decline in Relativity. It is in relativism that skepticism comes nearest to nihilism. Relativism is a model of nihilism which persists because it is composed of a series of instants and acts whereof each one constitutes a something, and therefore does not fall into nothingness, but which conjointly, taken in relation to each other and measured by each other, all dissolve again and become possibles, not realities. Relativism knows not the door which leads from the prison of skepticism, but only knows the possibility of a man in prison being able to sustain existence if it comes to the worst. Edward May. The Abyss of Relativism. Relativism is characteristic of a skepticism which disintegrates the last remnants of matter, and has no reality left on which to test and confirm itself, a skepticism which has reached the void, while the thinking and calculating faculties yet persist, and only now, when they are no longer hemmed in existentially, are reaching the zenith of their fulfillment. Speech and logic, number and mathematics are attaining the peak of their perfection, but they offer only innumerable possibilities, innumerable styles, innumerable attitudes, innumerable worlds, and innumerable truths, all of which remain only possibilities, unless borne aloft by a living verity, and thus becoming reality. The significance of this attitude becomes clear when we recall that modern history began with man basing his whole existence upon consciousness and the self-certainty of thought, thus setting himself up as autonomous, and turning from his godly opposite, consciousness. No longer took direction from conscience, and the latter from God, but identified itself with being. In relativism, Descartes' cogito ergo does not get displaced, but completed, and in this thinking to completion man's faculty for thought shows in the glitter of its finest perfection. On the other hand, it reveals itself as the great error of modern days, since, instead of being able to get from being conscious to being, man finds that consciousness can offer him only possibilities, but no realities. If relativism appears in its purest form in modern physics and has taken its name from them, it is because man is able to walk there most securely. He is held up by a framework of figures and formulae, like a spider by its web, and can turn about among all kinds of possibilities. But words do not possess the precision of figures. No network can be woven from them on which man can turn about, unless he is supported by other vital and primitive forces. What distinguishes relativism and raises it sky high above most of its critics, is the honesty and logicality with which it treads the road of skepticism to the end. It is bound to be passionately opposed by all the other isms, because it cancels their claims to absolute validity. One day seed will be sown in the soil it is preparing. In relativism, human consciousness breaks down one after another of the existential supports which man had erected upon it, thereby itself becoming relative. It becomes, that is to say, a function, an instrument, a possibility. The greatest effort is needed to maintain this attitude right through to the end of the either or choice, but it is the only one to escape the darkening of consciousness. If nihilism begins on the far side of relativism, freak varieties of skepticism appear on the near side, all recognizing that the certainty of consciousness has been exploded, yet manifesting a will to establish consciousness, as the only solid ground for existence, at any cost. The mental attitude which seeks further confirmation from the negation to which skepticism has led is very near to nihilism. Consciousness, insulted, deceived, and doubting itself, longs to show its power negatively, since it can no longer do so positively and creatively. By destroying other attempts to find a sure foundation, it confirms its own power. The desire finds an outlet in cynicism, the particular attribute of an upper intellectual strata which lacks the primitive vital forces of the masses and is peculiarly indebted to consciousness. It is not going too far to say that the attitude of the upper strata during the crisis is in the main one of cynicism, employing the term in its contemporary, and not its classical sense. In cynicism, man elevates himself above his culture without abstaining from drawing validity and enjoyment from it. He affirms his consciousness by disintegrating everything around him, and refuses to be fearful of anything, even of the crisis itself. The intellectual wisecrack and witty paradox are chief among his weapons. Cynicism increases with the crisis, its aim being to make conscious existence secure. In this, it is clearly differentiated from hedonism, which has as its aim the happy life of the individual, an aesthetic self-delectation, a pleasure and enduring satisfaction in egoism. The individual who amid the collapse of culture desires to make his conscious life secure, falls back on Stoicism, with its ethical system based on the urge for self-preservation. The Stoic certainly maintains consciousness as the sole foundation of his existence, but he begins with the transformation of his being, striving to emancipate it from everything which might constitute a threat. Such a man desires to keep free of all desire and of fear, and regards other goods, like honor, possessions, health, and even life itself, as matters of perfect indifference. His highest value is an inviolable calm, his ideal the sage who has attained complete independence. Stoicism represents the regression of consciousness upon itself. Its concepts of duty and virtue lead to man being reshaped within, and its ethical system expresses man's desire to remain true to himself. It therefore provides an anteroom to a religious renovation to which it will one day ascend, when, that is to say, it gives up the urge to maintain itself and to assert its consciousness. The apathy for which the Stoic strives is void and without content, for it is only serving to secure his own ego. Even the concept of duty and virtue cannot hide the fact that the man with his consciousness is growing stiff above a void. He often claims to be seeing things and taking people as they are, but he sees only the external side of phenomena, despite the tendency to inwardliness, and he isolates himself by his refusal to interfere. Relativism, cynicism, hedonism, and Stoicism are normally emergent attitudes in a declining culture, their prototypes appearing in Greece and Rome. But because Western man has been impelled by greater expectations and achieved a greater measure of consciousness, two other phenomena, heroism and fanaticism, have appeared. Heroism, the attitude of man as a fighter, is in its pure form a rarity. It most frequently occurs as tragic heroism when it is closely akin to fatalism. Innumerable individual experiences in the last decades have contributed to and melted into it. Men sitting numb and helpless listening to the scream of shells, men marching off to the front where a column is pushing forward, irresistible and inexorable. The loss of money, of employment, of home, the howling of sirens and the waiting rigid in a cellar, these and countless other experiences convince man that pitiless forces, inaccessible to consciousness, rule his life. Dark hangs the event impending over man. How is he to meet his hard, immutable destiny? Lamenting and despairing, or taking arms against his sea of troubles? With big words and exalted thoughts idealism prepares to do battle. Let not my little final hour be a time of impotence, prayed Walter Flex, who fell in front of Oslo. In a world grown dark and senseless, weighed down by fate, man, no longer believing or thinking, sustains himself in despair, yet fighting for an honorable defeat. The attitude of tragic heroism increases where consciousness is more powerfully engaged, and where it has to hold the final if not really defensible lines by all possible means, including fanaticism. The fanatic perceives the untenable nature of his position, he knows that what he contends for can be easily rebutted, yet it is the only thing to which he cleaves and which makes his existence possible. Therefore, to maintain himself he must extirpate his opponent. He is imprisoned within himself, and his consciousness is on borderline of intoxication. Fanaticism arises from the craving for security of the weakened consciousness, already swamped by the elementary might of the unconscious and by emotional forces, while the intelligent upper strata incline towards cynicism and stoicism, while youth follows it. Natural urge towards heroism, fanaticism is characteristic of the semi-educated middle and lower strata. Having a technically rationalized world around them, and being provided with a normalized, standardized consciousness, they attain a high degree of certainty because everything is presented to them in a simplified form, while at the same time, and having never been disquieted by deeper intellectual problems, they are ill prepared for any shattering experiences. Being near to the primitive and, though often sentimental, the emotional realms, including the religious, these strata fight for a consciousness whose possession seems to them the guarantee of their place in the upper stratum, for which reason its half-truths are passionately defended. Fanaticism has pseudo-religious features and easily slides over into a faith, the dogmatic content of which is set by consciousness. The last stage of the darkening of consciousness ensues. Overpowered by anguish, it falls into intoxication, to sink down to the preconscious and subconscious plane of the magical. Since the rationalized middle and lower strata preponderate in the artificial technical world of modern civilization, fanaticism has become common and is continuing to win ground. It draws its strength from the crisis, and retroactively increases the crisis, so that a vicious circle is set up. Thus events are set in motion which must subject cynicism and stoicism and tragic heroism to most grievous and exhaustive trials. All these attitudes are affected by historical reflection. Just as the stoicism of the Romans had already been broken by the image of Greek stoicism, so stoicism of today is conditioned by knowledge of its antecedents. It follows that stoicism today is different from that of earlier ages, a consideration that applies to most phenomena of modern life. Eugene Rosenstock points this out in respect of revolution. The Russian Revolution was already in a quite different situation from all those which preceded it. Its executives knew of the French Revolution and had studied it exhaustively. But that threatened the authenticity and uniqueness of their own movement. To maintain its originality, therefore, the Russian Revolution had one way out, which is indeed the way it took. It had to announce itself as the last of the revolutions. Its validity had to depend on its finality. The Russian Revolution accordingly aimed to be a long-term revolution. Permanent revolution is the only means for Bolshevism to maintain its claim to constitute something more than just another revolution. Eugene Rosenstock, European Revolution. Ortega Gasset points to the same factor. European man, he writes, has been democratic, liberal, absolutist, feudal, but is so no longer. He goes on being all these, but he is also one who has been them. If he had not all these experiences behind him and they did not continue in has-been form, it would be possible for him, when faced with the difficulties of present political life, to attempt to adopt one of these attitudes. But having once been something is a force which automatically prevents one's being it. In the contemporary political crisis society in the West is noticing that it cannot just be straight liberal, democratic, monarchical, feudal, nor just pharaonic, for the very reason that, either of itself or through the experience of others, it has already been them. How does historical reflection, which nowadays supervenes on all men's mental attitudes, work out? Does it weaken such attitudes? Or make them harder and inexorable? Does it make them relative? Or does it lift them up through consciousness itself to real absolutism? These two are by no means mutually exclusive. Historical reflection weakens these attitudes because it takes away from their freshness and originality, their feeling of novelty and uniqueness. Man sees in advance his mental attitude is relative. Nonetheless, he has to adopt it because he is aboriginally born in that direction. For there is not an infinity, but only a limited repertoire of human attitudes, and in the course of history the repertoire is repeated. This inner weakness, however, conditioned as it is by historical reflection, leads to conscious external exaggeration, to make up for the lack of originality. Faced with the relativism of his attitude, man rises to a conscious absolutism which mixes together all the ingredients of the past, and seeks by superheating them to make them unique. He meets three special factors in the process. First, the New World unity of the 20th century, which turns any personal attitude into a world trend. Next, the factor of permanence, wherein the eschatological dynamism of history gets linked with this new world unity. And finally, and closely connected with it, the factor of finality, the lurking expectation of the last days and the end for history. All three of these factors were made use of by the Russian Revolution, which based itself as I, a world revolution, 2, a permanent revolution, and 3, the last and final revolution sociologically secured as such by the working man's last stand. Historical reflection therefore leads to overzealous absoluteness. Man seeks to make up for the absence of honesty and original truth by external extremes. For that reason all his mental attitudes today are penetrated with anguish, and because of the anguish all his attitudes become more or less fanatical. We therefore have a peculiarly absurd phenomenon of fanatical relativism. We have the fanatical wit and word juggling of cynicism, the fanatical imperturbability, apathy, and indifference of stoicism. We have an Hagen of Tronier who knows that he is riding down his decline, and we have this, too, is paradoxical enough a fanatical fanaticism, which inflames itself with the knowledge of how fanatical it is. Historical reflection makes weak inwardly, but at the same time it externally strengthens every mental attitude, and by so doing it enforces just what it lacks itself: uniqueness, peculiarity, novelty, never yetness. It thus confers upon the crisis of Western culture, and through it on the world crisis, for the Western crisis is establishing itself as a final world crisis and apocalyptic uniqueness. As all these attitudes move along a scale which begins with skepticism and ends with nihilism, with the individual passing from doubt into despair, and as the crisis shows a tendency to sweep everything away, leaving no faith in the kingdom that is of this world, We can only await through crisis the revelation of an event in the spiritual world for which man can prepare, but which he can no longer speculatively apprehend. The Christian is possessed of his Pater Noster, thy kingdom come. 7. The question as to the original guilt from which the crisis arose has so far only been touched on superficially. It points to a failure in human perceptions long before our present crisis, but a special chapter has been devoted to the subject. So far the functional value of the organ with which man sought to become master of the crisis has been investigated. It has been shown that consciousness, upon which man has based his whole existence, has been made secure only by the mechanistic worldview of the natural sciences, which has been transposed onto all the manifestations of culture. In accordance with this, all events are alien to man and subject to the law of causality. Man can only adapt his conduct to the laws of events when consciousness can perceive them. Culture is also subject to this reign of law over culture. However, man possesses greater power. Since he fashioned it himself, he can modify it. From the standpoint of consciousness, search into the causes of the crisis can be made in 4 directions: in the relationship of culture to nature and the universe, in the apparatus of culture itself, in the relationship of culture to man, and in the relationship of man to culture. Correspondingly, there are 4 possible ways of intervening and liquidating the crisis, by modifying culture in its relationship to nature and the universe, to itself, or to mankind, that is by proceeding to an external reconstruction, or by changing man's conduct in respect of culture. All 4 possibilities have been tried and are still being tested, mostly together and in juxtaposition. Choice of method at a given moment is determined by the interests man is trying to preserve. The effort to modify culture in its relationship to nature and the universe has a long history, for it is precisely in this that the developmental process of modern times has found its strongest impulse and its greatest success. Since natural science has demonstrated the truth of the mathematical experimental method in the attainments of technique, that is to say, from the second half of the 18th century, she has repeatedly succeeded in enlarging the relationship of culture to nature and the universe, and thus lugging mankind over the danger points of crisis as they reveal themselves. Beginning with the textile era of the 18th century, the last 2 centuries have moved through the steel and machine era, the traffic, coal, chemical, and electrical eras, onto motorcars, airplanes, radio, and artificial surrogates, all the time by virtue of new discoveries which, in their time, have decisively modified the cultural setup. Today atomic fission has opened elemental forces to man which seem completely to overshadow all forms of energies hitherto available, and to inaugurate a novel age. After the initial experiences with atom bombs, however, a new invention has, for the first time in 200 years, not evoked fresh optimism, but laid an almost mountainous weight on humanity and increased men's anguish. For the first time also, the voices of scientists prophesying a splendid future have been few, and the voices of warning have greatly predominated. It seems inevitable that atom fission will go on modifying human culture, and that the 20th century will see the atomic era, but man is no longer promising himself an improvement of his situation. He looks on the new development, which he regards as compulsory and inevitable, with fear and anguish, and for the moment no new impulse is being followed to free mankind from the hopeless discomfort of its situation. With the exception of a very few physicists, industrialists, and technocrats, men are asking themselves how the crisis can be remedied by atomic energy. The new gloom over science means that the first of the 4 possibilities can be left out of our considerations. The second possibility is the modifying of culture in relation to itself. Modern technical culture has been erected on the model of the world mechanism of science. If the apparatus is giving a faulty performance, the causes may lie in the apparatus itself, which needs inspection, and, like an engine, to be brought into tip-top condition again. This was the first reaction to the crisis, a mighty overhaul. Significantly enough termed rationalization, of the technical apparatus to remove the worn parts and put new in their place, and to renovate the whole machinery basically. This possibility is still being followed, supplemented by another method for which the apparatus is secondary. The central nerve, as it were, of the apparatus is capital, and alongside technical and industrial rationalization and overhaul of capital is proceeding. Old values still recorded in the ledgers, but long ago become fictitious, are being written down, and new credits and loans are being granted to create new values and bring the machinery to a higher pitch of perfection. Man has been overhauling the apparatus, technically and financially, for 4 decades, however, without having yet remedied the crisis. On the contrary, the crisis has grown worse, and it is easy to understand why this attempt now meets with skepticism, thus being deprived of the psychological impulse which was an important element in the help it was supposed to bring. The third possibility would involve human adaptation to culture in an unprecedented fashion. It is closely linked with the first two. For any modification of culture will demand human adaptation to the new conditions. Rationalization accepts this as so completely natural that in the technical case it simply puts a man on the street without employment, and in the financial case writes off his values, and thus appropriates them. In rationalization man is forcibly caught and brought into line. Since in pure rationalism consciousness is still dominated by the concepts of mechanism, it has no organ for sensing the human consequences which unemployment, devaluation, bankruptcy, and Black Fridays are bound to involve, and burns up wheat and coffee without compunction because according to the laws of rationalism it is sensible to do so. However, affairs do not always go so simply, even with the aid of the state, for whenever imperiled, rationalism is forced towards totalitarianism. The primitive vital and emotional components of man are uprooted and become more refractory and unaccountable. Even the gigantic propaganda apparatus which in our technical civilization, from morn to eve, enwraps man like a hideous polyp with 1,000 arms, and holds him prisoner, is constantly failing of its effect. Nothing looks more senseless and paradoxical than a neon-lit advertisement on the wall of a blitzed house. Consequently, it is getting ever harder to move men to adapt their relationship to culture, and when anguish itself fails, rationalism is quite helpless, and surrenders before the crisis. It has at its disposal only the traditional means of information, propaganda, and education, which fail just when man is most deeply affected by some event. So far rationalism has not succeeded in removing the crisis from the apparatus or from man himself. The fourth possibility looks in the opposite direction. It does not see the cause of the crisis in man's maladaptation to the apparatus, but in the apparatus not corresponding to the nature of man, and therefore needing to be adapted to it. Culture ceases to be the pivot of thought, and human rights become central. This interpretation develops only slowly during the crisis, as the gravity of events brings men to the alert and mobilizes them, while at the beginning of the crisis the prevailing view is that culture is central and man only the object of it. The course of events seems to make it clear that man is the subject of what happens, not in the sense of himself being at all guilty for what occurs, but only in the sense that, without having merited or caused it, he has become passively involved in his wretchedness and suffering. Man is slow in realizing that culture ought to exist for him, and for none other, and that he has the right and power to change it if it no longer corresponds to his nature and expectations. Man should say how he wants to live, and culture should adapt itself to suit his wishes, no matter what values are destroyed or rights and privileges violated in the process. This interpretation can take the gales of crisis into its own sails. For as a crisis deepens, culture naturally appeals less and less to each man's wishes. Winning majority approval has become the dominant thesis of our age, and in the future will gain even more support. For all its apparent wisdom, it is really quite absurd, for it has only what man wants, not what he ought to want. Like the other interpretations, it clings to the thesis that man is a cunning being who can base his existence upon consciousness alone. Yet it is consciousness which is undergoing crisis, and has already suffered a process of change and darkening, by which its expectations have been influenced. These four possibilities have all been tested during the last 34 years and are still being tested, and have had only an irritant and negative effect upon the crisis. In the whirl of events, man's thought is thrust slowly back to the problem of himself, at which limit it retires into shattered amazement. When rationalism meets the human enigma, it bursts like soap bubble. And the human solution of the crisis which to adapt culture to man reaches the same limit and reveals its emptiness. It asks man, as a rational being, what he wants to do and what rights he claims, and of course learns within the crisis that man's will is quite unreasonable and his demands immeasurable. At which point it meets the question from which it should have set out. What ought man to want, and which of his demands are justifiable? In other words, what is man? The more directly man meets this question, the more he is displaced from the center of events and escapes from his subjectivity. Not possessing a measure wherewith he can measure himself. But he only confronts the question when driven to a point where doubt turns back on himself, and it may be a long time before he reaches it. Of their very nature, 3 out of these 4 possibilities specified belong together and are closely related, as follows: if I enlarge culture by bringing the new atomic energy to it, if I overhaul its apparatus and pump more loans into it, and compel men by force or induce them by persuasion so to behave and adapt themselves that the apparatus functions, then obviously the crisis will have been overcome, and the vast mechanism of world culture will once again begin to tick without friction. In this thesis, the first 3 possibilities are bound up together. Over against them stands the 4th possibility. The crisis will be overcome only when culture adapts itself to men and is made subject to the rights and demands of man's nature. These theses are opposed to each other all over the world, and today are in embittered conflict. It would be easy to simplify the opposition concretely by pointing out that the center of the first thesis lies in New York, and the second in Moscow, that the first is covered by the concept of capitalism, and the second by that of socialism. An interpretation on those lines would itself remain within the purview of the old view of the world, adding nothing to it. Lowe recognized that the opposition in the macrocosm of politics is found in the microcosm of the individual takes one a little farther. For, despite the gigantic destruction, every human being possesses external values, though it be only in imagination, which he desires to maintain. Every person is, however, increasingly conditioned by the dark elemental forces of his being, which, limited by culture, seeks to liberate itself. And the 4th possibility promises him this liberty. The 2 theses stand diametrically opposed, but they are encompassed by the dogma of the sufficiency of consciousness, and therefore constitute polarities and not incompatibles, just as they are polarically related in the microcosm of each individual. Polarities are subject to the law of reciprocal influence and assimilation, which peacefully or otherwise works towards a synthesis. If differences lead to violence, ending in conquerors and conquered, they are ironed out because the conqueror is always infected by the conquered. A rule of life whose deep significance has been grasped only by religious perception as expressed in the saying "resist not evil." The peoples whose tradition belongs to the old Renaissance and who want to keep what they have attained are looking to the first three possibilities. The peoples of the new Renaissance, who do not want to be cheated of their expectations, are looking to the fourth possibility. When the polarity has led to a leveling out, the new Renaissance peoples will, on the basis of the second thesis, free themselves from the compulsion of culture and fight to win their freedom, and, possessing themselves of the culture, of which they merely constituted the object, will proceed to test out the first three possibilities with new vitality and primitive force. As the leveling out will be global, it will be a matter of comparative indifference whether its center is New York or Moscow. To a mind fixed in the old categories of consciousness, this interpretation will appear paradoxical and incomprehensible, because it regards the motive of polarity and the macrocosm of politics not as an alternating relationship, but as an irreconcilable opposition, and because in war it does not see the active form of leveling out, but a removal of the opposition through the segregation of the hostile partner. Nor will it grasp the true opposition of the present epoch, which is without polarity, two different planes of being having no common framework. These are the world dominated by man and the world dominated by God. The former belongs to the material world this side, the latter to that beyond. In the former question will be of little interest for me, since the only important question is the opposition between me and God. All four possibilities belong among the ancient categories of consciousness, but as the crisis is breaking out of an area which lies or the far side of such categories, neither perception nor remedy can be expected from them. Indeed, man is not really willing to perceive the meaning of the crisis or to remove it, despite his paradoxical yearning and gigantic expenditure of energy. His one desire is to make his consciousness secure, which is to say, to maintain his autonomy as a man god at whatever price, even at the price of his own destruction. Whether it is in wresting new secrets and energies from nature, overhauling the apparatus of culture, readapting men, and establishing equalitarianism, or subjecting culture to man's, it is still a matter of man's consciousness resisting the crisis, of his maintaining consciousness and allowing nothing to impugn his self-certainty. When the source of trouble is sought in man himself, it is sought in man's consciousness, not in his essence, and efforts remove the crisis never get beyond external changes. After nearly 40 years, man is running round in the crisis like a circus horse in the manege, sacrificing all he possesses, and last of all himself. The question about man is the only question the skeptical method fails to answer, because it disintegrates in it. The doubt against oneself returns, and leads to desperation, and the method breaks down. Man is therefore faced with a demand to leave the basis of consciousness and look for another level of existence, and only as he succeeds in reaching it does a new perception of the cause and of the crisis become open to him. Man is guilty of what happens. The crisis is not alien to, but man himself is the crisis. Changes of culture are therefore a matter of indifference. Our concern is with the inner transformation of man. This sentence sounds so harmless and unimportant. Everyone can acknowledge its truth, and it creates a good impression in the speeches of statesmen, and the programs of the isms, to say nothing of books concerning man in this world. Yet it is just this sentence, properly understood, which leads to an actual darkening of consciousness. It leads, that is to say, to the place where man is beginning to leave consciousness as his basis. This is an inexorable road, but it is frightening. Man is responsible for what happens, but everything turns upon whether we say the other man is guilty, or I myself am guilty. In the first case the other man has to be paid out. In the second case I am myself standing before the victims and wreckage of the last 34 years as the guilty person who must be punished. In the first stance I judge men and am judged by men. In the second I alone am present, split into two persons, one who judges and one who is judged. And the more I, as the judged party, accept the guilty of him who judges, the clearer it becomes to me that as judging I am acting in a different capacity, and that over me as judging and as judge there stands another, to whom I am related and before whom I find the unity of my being in the degree to which I recognize him. For man does not constitute a unity, but a three-in-oneness, admittedly a different three-in-oneness from that of the animal, in which only a world within, a body, and a world without are realized. He stands in a relationship which, according to Kierkegaard, is related to itself, and it is only inside this related to itselfness that it is related to any other. Since it experiences desires to itself, the self itself is transparently centered in the power which set it there. Man seeks to avoid the terrible reality of his own guilt by accusing the other man, who, as the sole guilty party, must be liquidated. Once the other man is liquidated, the cause of the crisis will be removed. Only when he has tested out this possibility and it has led him to a complete impasse will man look at the second possibility. Meeting his own guilt face to face, calling himself to account for all that he has done to others. Payment of that reckoning can end only with the annihilation of the man that has been. This is the true process of transformation to which the crisis leads and without which it cannot be liquidated. Instead of man passing into the zone of the magical sustained by intoxication, he moves into the zone of the mystical, which is conditioned by despair. Both lead to a reshaping of consciousness, now advancing towards complete darkness. In the intoxication of the magical he experiences the eruption of the dark power of his being from which he has isolated himself. It overfloods his consciousness, and he becomes obsessed. In the desperation of mysticism he works upon and purifies himself, tearing himself away from the demons and creating a new consciousness. However, he can no longer do by his own power, but as the godly opposite or counterpart raises him up. This new consciousness can therefore no longer maintain itself autonomously, but only as a servant, as a function, in the Trinity of God. Conscience and consciousness, it constitutes only the instrument by which announcement is made.